I'm going to tell you about motor racing in the 1960s, which is generally considered to be the golden era of particularly British motor racing. The first picture, as you can see, is an unfortunate accident at Brands Hatch in the Lotus Elite. This was in 1962, and that car, 8 MPG, still exists. It's a very well-known car, and when I was 20, I managed to win the National Motorsport Championship and was the youngest driver ever to have won that award. There's a story attached to this. I was racing against Graham Warner, Les Leston, who were also very, very fast elite drivers. And I got a pit signal saying I was third fastest. I thought, well, this is not good enough. We have to do better than this. The next thing I knew, I woke up in an ambulance. There was a coloured lady, a nurse, trying to take down my trousers to give me an anti-tetanus injection. Well, when I woke up and saw that, I thought, you know, this frightened me more than the accident, and I blacked out again. And I woke up in Dartford Hospital, and I had concussion. So I still don't remember that accident. I remember going past the pits and seeing the signal, then waking up in the ambulance, but the piece in between is blank, I don't know. But we looked at the wreck, and we think the accident was caused not by my bad driving or mistakes, but on the Elite, the rear right-hand wheel is held in place by the drive shaft. And we think the well broke between the shaft and the wheel coupling. So the wheel came out, steered the car into a spin at about 90 miles an hour. It hit the earth bank just behind the pits at Brands Hatch at South Bank Bend, flew up in the air, somersaulted, and came down upside down and broke the monocoque into two. Now the only the thing that saved me, you can see the seat back is supporting the roof. If that seat wasn't there, I probably would have had a broken neck and wouldn't be here today. But I did rebuild the car and repainted it in a very nice metallic blue colour, and it went on to win the Autosport Championship. And that car still exists today. It's owned by a lady, I think, in the northwest, and she uses it for hill climbs very successfully. I should have really started at the beginning, but I originally started motor racing at age 17, so I'm going back a bit now. This is a year later. And I had no idea about how to drive, no idea about lines, and I knew nothing about it at all. And when somebody mentioned the word Lotus, I thought it was an oriental flower. I didn't realise it was a car. I really had no idea at all. And I had a Austin Healey 3000 at the time that my father bought for me, just a standard car, usual things, badges across the front that boys do, put on big spotlights, long radio aerial, and no idea how to drive it. And at that time we had several car showrooms in London. I was standing in the head office in Leytonstone, talking to one of the salesmen, and he said to me, "Why don't you race your Healey?" So I thought, well, that's not a bad idea. I said, "How do I do that?" He said, "Well, go to the RAC, get your competition license, apply to one of the clubs, and then apply for a race entry, and if you accept it, I'll come down and show you the ropes," which is what I did. And we went down to Brands Hatch on the 5th of March 1961 with a Healey, and the only concession I did to modify it was put on a set of racing tyres. And they were £20 each at the time, and we got a 50% discount. So we had 4 racing tyres on there, nothing else. But we did have an overdrive on the car. There was a built-in overdrive on the dashboard, on a flick switch, which you could use as a gear. And my idea was to go around the track on the inside like a running track, thinking that I'll cover less distance and therefore go faster. But that was not correct. And I practiced. I came down the straight doing about 115 miles an hour. Went into notorious Paddock Bend, which is a very dangerous bend. And it certainly was then, because there was no runoff at all. You just went straight into the bank if you came off the earth bank. And I thought, I'll use the overdrive to save changing gear. It'll save time. So I flicked it out of overdrive, and it went into paddock sideways, and it immediately spun off. But luckily, it didn't go outside onto the banking, it spun on the inside, so no harm done. Came back into the paddock, and this chap he approached, he was the track manager at the time, and he'd seen what I was trying to do. And he said, son, he said, you're not doing it quite right. He said, come with me, will you? I said, yes. So we went to the stand on Paddock Bend, and he said, now watch this third car coming down the straight, and watch the way he goes around the next corner after Paddock, Druids Bend, which is a hairpin. And he said, you see, it starts on the left-hand side, and it cuts across the apex, and again tries to straighten out before it gets to the next curve. In other words, he tries to make a straight line as opposed to a sharp bend. He said, that's what you've got to do. Well, I did that in the race, and I finished up second somehow. Still not quite sure how, but I finished up second and went back into the paddock, and I saw lots of these little Lotus Elites about, because they hadn't been long introduced. And the Healy was a great car, but very heavy, not really suitable for racing. It was a rally car, far more suited to rallying. And it seemed that the car I should have had is a Lotus Elite if I wanted to go racing. So we bought a Lotus Elite. I think it was £1,950. And I thought, well, I can go out and win with this. But that wasn't the case. I started in '61. I didn't get placed at all, in fact, early on. And I found the other elites were much faster down the straight and were faster around the corners. And I didn't know why. So I went and asked the mechanics, and they said, well, you need a 4-branch exhaust system, you need to modify the engine, you need to change this, you need to change the timing wheel from fibre to steel, you need different camshafts, and you need to throw away your single issue carburetor and put on twin 4-choke Weber carburetors, a lot of things. Again, we did that, and I started to go a bit quicker. And during '61, I think I had my first win, 1 or 2 seconds and a third. '62, which is this year, I began to get a lot quicker. I remember going around Snetterton in the Elite, down the pit straight, at what I thought was a fast speed, and you've got a right-hand bend after the pits, which I think is called Sierra. I moved over onto the left side, about to turn into the corner, and then Graham Warner in Love 1, which was the fastest Elite about, came flying by. I was braking, he was accelerating past me. He put it into the corner, sideways on, put his hand out the window and waved. So I thought, there's something wrong here, there's something I'm not doing right. So I still hadn't become really quick. But I found by 1960, well, end of '62, I was getting lots of firsts and seconds, and I was as quick as Graham and Les Leston. And that's when I won the Motorsport Championship in 1963. At that point, BP approached me, and they liked what I was doing, and they wanted to assist me for 1964. And they said, what do you want to do? They took me out for lunch at a place called Le Coq d'Or in London, which is a very nice restaurant in the West End. And I said, well, I'd like to buy one of these new Brabham sports cars that I believe Jack Brabham's building for next year. And they said, fine. We said, we like the idea. Yeah, we'll give you some assistance on that. I said, fine. So I went with my father and Bernie Eccleston, who was a family friend, down to Newhall in Surrey to see Jack Brabham and Ron Taranack, his designer, and discuss the new car. There were 3 engines available. One was the new 2-litre V8 BRM, which wasn't recommended, it was too new. There was the 2.5 Coventry Climax, which was a Formula 1 engine, or the new 2-litre Coventry Climax short-stroke engine. And we decided, probably wrongly, on the 2-litre, thinking we don't want too much of a jump from the Elite into this, what was actually faster than a Formula 1 car at the time, because a Formula 1 car was only 1,500cc then. And we went into the office with Jack and Bernie and Taranack, and the car it cost £3,500, and Brabham said it's £50 extra for the clutch. Now, I never really found out why it was £50 extra for the clutch, but anyway, it was £3,550, and delivery will be April 1964. And in April, the car was finished. I took it down, I forget which circuit it was now, one of the circuits to test it, and it didn't handle at all. It was quite frightening. I was actually faster in the Elite than this 2-litre Brabham sports car. And I didn't know at the time what was wrong with it. So we had another test day at Goodwood, and Graham Hill was there. And my mechanic at the time was Willie Griffiths. Well, Willie used to be Graham's Formula One mechanic with Team Lotus. And I said, Willie, would you ask Graham if you mind trying the car? Perhaps he can tell us what's wrong with it. So I didn't have the experience to know at that point. Because when you bought a racer car, it wasn't ready to race out of the box. You had to modify it and test it, and maybe change springs or shock absorbers or tyres, different width tyres, all kinds of things to think about, anti-roll bars, toe in and toe out and wheel cambers. And I knew nothing about these things yet. Anyway, Graham agreed to drive it. So off he goes. He does half a dozen laps and comes back and parks in the paddock. I think, oh, good, that's fine. I'll soon know what's wrong with this car, and we'll put it right. And he jumps out of the car and he starts to walk off. So I said, excuse me, I said, Jack. And, sorry, Graham. And I said, what's wrong with the car? He said, it's no good. Well, I said, I know that. I said, I want to know what's wrong with it. And he said, well, if I were you, I'd take it back to the makers, and walked off. Anyway, I then telephoned Ron Towndack and explained that Graham had driven the car and said it was no good, and I should come back to you. And he was quite upset at that. He didn't like the idea of Graham Hill driving the car and saying it was no good. So he then arranged, very kindly, for Jack Brabham to meet me at Goodwood. He was going to fly down, he flew down in his aeroplane, which he had at Fair Oaks, and he met me there, and we spent half a day testing together. And I learned more in that half a day with Jack than I had in 2 previous years by myself. I mean, Jack was world champion at the time, and to have the privilege of testing with a world champion was amazing. I mean, it would never happen today. And the first thing he sorted was the brakes, because they were rock hard and the car wouldn't stop. And that was a fairly simple thing to do. He just altered the settings on the balance bar, so the leverages were different, and that solved the braking problem. But it still wouldn't handle, it wouldn't go around corners. And he then tried to do different things. He altered the roll bar settings, the shock absorber settings. It did improve the car, but it still wasn't right. But he managed to get down to a time below the record. So he said, you go out and try it now and see what you think. But there was a bit of a problem there because I'd lost confidence in the car. And with a racing car and you're driving on the limit, if you haven't got the confidence, you can't drive it on the limit. I went out and I did a half a dozen laps, and I was about 2 seconds slower than Brabham. And I came in and I said, well, I'm a bit disappointed, because he said, well, you will be, because you've lost confidence in the car. He said, well, I've just broken the lap record in it. And I said, yes, that's fine. He said, the problem is, it's still difficult to drive. So I'm thinking, well, if the world champion finds it difficult to drive, what am I supposed to do? So it was helpful anyway. And with what I learned testing with Jack that day, I applied my own logic to things, and I put on stronger front springs, in fact, which Towndack actually recommended. I put on stronger front springs, made a big difference. I also increased the rear track and put wider wheels and tyres on, and a rear spoiler. And those several things transformed the car. It became very quick indeed. And I went out and I won the International Martini Trophy race at Silverstone, which was 50 laps on a Grand Prix circuit, and set up a new record with an average speed of 105 miles an hour, which in 1964 was pretty quick. And that was a very good thing, because that Martini race was quite an important race. So we're improving, we're getting on. But at the time I was racing with people like Jack Brabham in sports cars, Dan Gurney, Bruce McLaren. I got a great picture coming down the straight at Goodwood with Bruce McLaren in the Xeric Special. And we're just going down neck and neck past the pits. John Surtees, Dan Gurney. In fact, I had a race at Goodwood. It was the Tourist Trophy with Dan Gurney. And on the grid, before we get to that, you can probably see the grid here. Well, this is in fact going back a bit earlier. This is the elite. I'm on the back of the grid there, at 1:39.4 on the bottom, but it was actually the fastest elite time by half a second. And the reason I'm on the back of the grid is because I practiced out of session. So they put me on the back of the grid. But if you look at that grid, I mean, it's an amazing grid. You've got 5, 6 world champions on there. And you'll never, you've got Mike Parks there, you've got Innes Ireland, Roy Salvadori, Bruce McLaren, Roger Penske. You've got Frank Garner, Australian, Graham Warner. There's other similar ones which I'll show you. Oh, this was, I'm sorry, I haven't got this in quite the right order. This is going back to '63 now. This was a race at Brands Hatch in the elite. And I was racing against Jackie Oliver at the time in a similar car. And for 10 laps, we were dicing together. And on the last bend, on the last lap, I managed to get past Oliver, which was no easy thing to do, and won the race. And coming back, the mechanics were so excited, they picked me up and carried me back and on their shoulders. And as you can see, in those days, we used to race in a collar and tie. I mean, we didn't have seat belts or anything like that. Never gave it a second thought. And this is another good shot. This, on the left there, 23 is me in the BT8 with the 2-litre climax in. Behind me is Jimmy Clark in the Works Lotus 30. On the right is Denny Hulme in a similar car. And you can see just in front of Denny Hulme's car, there's a signature, which is Jim Clark's signature. So, I mean, people like Jimmy Clark, I mean, they were so good. And when they were on form, and they mostly were on form, you couldn't beat him. He was that much quicker than anybody else. An amazing driver, a natural driver, and a very nice person. Here's Jimmy Clark again, at Mallory Park in the Works Lotus 30. It had the 4.7-litre Ford V8 engine in. I'm there in the orange helmet. I finished third at Jimmy on that race. So although not in Formula One, I was racing against world champions in Formula One, but in sports cars. And I sometimes think what I should have done is got into Formula One instead of sports cars, because when we went down to meet the Sir Brabham to order the BT8, as we came out of his office, I looked on the wall and I saw a picture of a Formula One car that I didn't recognise. So I said to Jack, I said, what Formula One car is that, Jack? Oh, he said, that's our new Formula One car for next year. And I said, oh. I said, how much is it? And he said, £5,000. Now, at that moment, Bernie and I had eye contact. We're both thinking the same thing. We've just paid £3,350 for a sports car. For another £1,500, we can get a Grand Prix car. I mean, the money was there. And then the moment passed. We were distracted, something happened, and it was forgotten about. But I often think, at that moment, had I got into Formula One, things might have been very different. But one never knows. I mean, I might have been dead. Because a lot of drivers died. Every month a driver died in those days. But an interesting thought. But the fact I'm still alive, I suppose, makes me think that I made the right decision. Well, that's the BT8 winning the International Martini Trophy with the 2-litre climax in. A lovely car. There's another grid here, an illustrious grid. You've got Bruce McLaren, you've got Jimmy Clark, you've got Graham Hill, Denny Hulme, Hugh Dibley. You've got, I'm on the third row there. Well, I only had a 2-litre engine, so I'm on the third row. You've got Dan Gurney behind me. He was in a 7-litre Daytona Cobra. And although I was faster than Dan, he outdragged me at the start and got into the first corner Magic, which is the right-hand bend after the start, before me. And I can tell you now, you try to get him on Dan Gurney in a 7-litre Daytona Cobra with a 2-litre Brabham, it's not an easy thing to do. And I was stuck behind him for quite a long while. And it was very frustrating because he would pull out quite a long lead on the straight. I'd get right up close under braking for the corners and draw really close on the bends. But, getting past this cobra going sideways wasn't an easy thing. I had trouble passing him. I did eventually get by. And I did something very uncharacteristic. Rather rude, I shouldn't have done it. I was so frustrated, I held up my hand and made a rude sign to him as I passed him. The wrong thing to do with Dan Gurney. As we went into Madgwick, I was about to turn right into the corner, and all of a sudden, the whole of my right side is filled with blue and white Daytona Cobra. He stormed up sideways, put the brakes on, stormed up the straight rather, put the brakes on, flung it sideways into the corner, and again was back in front of me. So that didn't do me any good at all, and was very rude, shouldn't have done it. But eventually he stopped for fuel, because that would have only done about 7 or 8 miles per gallon, so I got back in front again. But again, a great grid. You won't see grids like that today. This is in fact the BT8, and I wanted to get more overall wins, so we thought we'd put in a V8 engine and take out the 2D Climax and put in a V8 American engine. And the idea was fine, the concept was fine, and we had contacts with General Motors in America, because at the same time I was converting Hillman imps, which a lot of you may remember. In fact, we were the foremost company in the world for imp conversions. And this is how we got to know General Motors, who bought out Roots. It became Chrysler. And they said, well, we can give you an aluminium block Oldsmobile engine, the 3.5 litre, which is a huge advantage because the iron 4.7 litre Ford engines were very heavy. They weighed hundreds of pounds. So by putting in an aluminium engine, a bigger capacity into the BT8, it would be a similar weight to the Climax with a lot more power. But unfortunately, the engine was modified in the States, and when it came over, unpacked, it looked fantastic. And we got Frank Costin, who was in fact an aerodynamicist. He helped to design the Lotus Elite, and he did the Van Wall Formula One bodies. Frank installed the engine in his workshop in Wales over the winter of '64, and I raced the car in '65. And you can see there's an aluminium cover there under what's supposed to be a rollover bar, and the engine was on rubber mounts. And when you put your foot down, it was the engine used to nudge the back of the seat, which is a bit concerning. But as you can see, the seat back's resting on the back of that cover, which is the engine behind it. But when the car went, it went very well indeed. But it kept blowing up. That was the problem. And we kept welding the block up. I think in the end, the block had more weld than the original metal on it. And I entered it to the race at Euston, near Newcastle upon Tyne. It's an airfield circuit, and it was an annual event. It was called the Euston Gold Cup. And just before that, the engine had blown up again. So we repaired it, but it wasn't run in. And there wasn't time to put it on the dynamometer. So what we did, I drove the car from North London, where our works were, all the way to Newcastle upon Tyne up the A1. Because in those days, there was no speed limits on the road. I mean, you could do 200 miles an hour if you could. And nobody could stop you. And being a sports car, it was road legal. It had lights, indicators, and it had, we had trade plates, of course, to put on. I remember being stopped by the police on the road, and they said, yes, we can see your lights and your indicators. He said, where's your horn? And of course, racing cars don't have hooters. So I said, here it is, officer. I went, beep, beep, beep. There's a little rubber bulb hooter under the dash. But I mean, it didn't say what type of horn you had to have. It was just a horn. So he said, go on, he said, off you go. And I remember getting stuck in a traffic jam between Biggleswade and Bulldog on the A1. It was summertime. And of course, there's no fan in the racing car, and if it stands still for more than a few minutes, it overheats. So we had to pull over, let it cool down, and go off again. Drove it all the way to Newcastle, and it had a problem. It kept oiling out the sparking plugs. But I noticed if it idled, the plugs would oil up. And sometimes you could clear on certain engines, you could clear an oiled up plug, but here it wouldn't clear at all on this engine. Once it fouled up, it stayed fouled up. So it was on 7 cylinders or 6 or whatever it was. So we got to Newcastle, went out to practice, the same problem, oiling up plugs, fiddling about with it, and I realised that if I was going to get anywhere in this race, I couldn't start the engine and let it idle. I had to start the engine and straight away put the power on, so the plugs wouldn't wet up or oil up. But because of the trouble in practice, I had to start from the back of the grid, which I did. So the car was in neutral, engine wasn't running, all the other car engines were running, driver was ready to go. As soon as I saw the flag starting to fall, I pushed the start button, it fired up, I had it in gear, I let the clutch up and roared off for the rest of the field. And luckily, none of the plugs wet up, it was on 8 cylinders. I think there were about 35 or 36 cars in the race. I came through the field like a rocket. I mean, it just flew on 8 cylinders. And I had to push it. I remember going through one corner, and I thought I'd overdone this one. I was probably doing 130 miles an hour, and I came around this corner, and it slid right to the very edge of the circuit. It just stopped with it. Probably no more concrete at all left, or no more tarmac before it hit the grass. But I held it, won the race outright, and got the new circuit record. And that's me clutching my trophies. The right-hand one, no, the left-hand one was a silver cup, and that was called the Journal Trophy from the local newspaper who sponsored the race. And the other cup was the Houston Gold Cup for the outright circuit record. But unfortunately, that's about the only race the engine stood up for. So the rest of the season was pretty disastrous, mainly with engine problems, which is a pity. And you can see here, this is a Goodwood. We've got the whole transaxle off on the ground there. We've got 2 or 3 mechanics working on it, and somebody there saying, "Oh my God, not again." It was just a load of trouble. So the only thing to do with that was to sell it and move on to something else. Eventually it sold to somebody for hill climbing, who I think did quite well in the car with a different engine. Now, moving on to something different here, because I was the Hillman Imp expert, well, the main modifier fact, we used to sell complete race cars to routes in Venezuela, routes in Australia, fully race prepared. We'd fit fiberglass panels, and we changed the engine. It used to have the engine canted 45 degrees to the right using side draft carburetors. We turned it through 90 degrees so we could use downdraft carburetors. And we did all kinds of things. We even fitted the Coventry Climax engine in the back to see how that would go, make it a bit faster. But the Climax engine was a bit heavier. It was, once we developed the imp engine to give more power, it was far better and far lighter. It was a very, very light unit. It was die-cast aluminium, and you could actually go to the bench. I could pick this engine up and carry it out and put it in the car. It weighed 115 pounds. And we got, the standard engine used to give, it was 850cc, used to give about, I think it was 48 bhp. We increased the size to 1000cc and eventually got 110 bhp from it. And there were many problems. There were head gaskets used to blow, but we got around that problem by using a gas-filled pressure ring and machining a groove in the top of the cylinder with a separate gasket for the water jacket, and that cured the head gasket problem. We were the first people to cure that. We raced these imps regularly. I didn't actually like driving saloon cars because there was a lot of contact. I didn't like that kind of driving. I mean, when you're driving with people of world champion class, you don't make contact. It wasn't done. I mean, it wasn't the right thing to do, and it's not necessary. But in saloons, I'm afraid it was par for the course. And you really get rammed or pushed on the side, or somebody coming on the side of you. I didn't like it. And I eventually handed the car to another driver. But I won a lot of races in the Imp. And this one is an example at Brands Hatch. We're going, you can see Paddock Bend there, and then we're going up the hill to Druish, the hairpin. I'm leading. You've got Bill McGovern next in the Embry Imp, and behind him is Bernard Unit in the Fraser Imp, which was the most powerful car. And I remember coming down the straight, the governors coming along the side, we're going bang, bang, like down the straight, nudging each other to try and get into paddock first. And this is past the grandstands and all the people watching. It wasn't really the thing to do, but we both wanted to get into the paddock bend first. So after the first heat, we were summoned by the clerk of the course and said, you know, we mustn't do that. He said, you cannot go down the straight banging into each other. He said, you just can't do it. And then we said, okay, well, we're sorry, Nick. He said, if you want to do it, he said, do it round the back where nobody can see you. Anyway, that was saloon car racing in the 60s. A lot of fun. I used to we used to come down the straight probably about 120 miles an hour, maybe a bit less, 117, and just throw it into paddock bend sideways. Lots of lock, it would drift round the corner, which was handy because while it's drifting, nobody else can get by you, there's not enough room. So it was a good tactic to stop anyone passing me. And then in 1965, we decided to, well, Frank Costin in fact approached us with, he had a new car he wanted to build, a sports racing car with a wooden monocoque, all wooden monocoque. And he knew that we were making very good lightweight engines, and what he was looking for was something like that to put into his lightweight monocoque. So we struck a deal whereby he would build the cars, the monocoques in Wales, and send them down to us, and we would build the cars using the imp engines and transaxles. And as you can see, it was very successful. 10 outings, 9 places, 7 new lap records from the start. And looking at the price, 1950, I mean, that wouldn't even buy a set of tyres today. And that was the price of a complete car. I did a race. That's my father there, by the way, with a cigarette in his hand. He used to smoke 60 a day. And that's me with him when I was standing at the racing car show. This is the prototype car, the very first car we built. And this was a very good race, a very interesting story here. This is on the bank circuit at Montlhéry near Paris. I had a French agent called Dr. Moloff. Now, Dr. Moloff said, you know, I want to sell these cars in France for you, in Italy and other places, but you know, you need to come onto the continent and win some races so I can sell them. You know, I wasn't known on the continent then. I mean, you didn't have the exposure you've got now with the internet and computers and such like. It was all word of mouth on local magazines. So I said, okay, so you apply for an entry and I'll come over and we'll see what we can do. So he got us this entry in the Paris Cup, which was an international race qualifying for the European Sports Car Championship. And we packed the car up at our premises in Highgate, North London. We had a common van, a trailer, and my one mechanic from the West Country called Tony Boucher, and we set off for Montlhéry. And Dr. Moloff met us in Paris and took us to the circuit. Now, I've never driven on the bank circuit before, and the banking in Montlhéry is very high, and it's concrete, and it's very rough. So I wasn't quite sure how the car would handle. And I also needed to learn how to drive on the bank circuit, because things were different. I mean, there was no guardrail on top, but if you went too fast, you overdid it, you could in theory go over the top and fall off the banking. Went out to practice, and we had some problem with the front end bottoming, so I came back into the pits, and then we changed. In fact, we had to go back to the paddock, and we changed some stronger front springs, put stronger front springs on. I told the mechanic to put some different bump rubbers on the front shock absorbers, stiffen the rear anti-roll bar up a bit, and raise the ground clearance by ½ an inch on the front. At the same time, Fiat Abarth were there in force. And they were leading the European Sports Car Championship and wanted points to that championship. That's why they were there. And the team manager, called Senor Avedano, came over with a colleague to look at our car. Because they heard it was a wooden car, and they wanted to see what the competition was like. We had the body off. When they came over, they looked at it, and they were talking away in Italian, and they saw the wooden monocoque, and they laughed. If you think about it, you've got an unknown English driver with a wooden car he built himself, competing against the mitred Fiat Abarth, what's almost their own ground. And they had several cars in the event, and it just seemed ridiculous then that I could even be there. Anyway, having made these modifications, went out for another practice session, learnt the circuit. It was very strange going around the banking, because if you hit a bump, where there were bumps and you had to hit them, you hit these bumps, the car would sort of jump up 2 or 3 feet up the banking. It was a lot of stress on the car. I was concerned for the suspension, but it held. Came back into the paddock. Dr. Moloff came running over, holding up a piece of paper, and he said, look, he said, we've got fastest time. And he seemed quite surprised, and so did everybody else. I wasn't surprised, because I expected to do that. And then the two, Senor Avedano came over again, with his Italian colleague. They weren't laughing this time when they looked at the car. They looked very, very serious indeed. Anyway, the Abarths had more power. And I knew that if they got in front of me in the first corner, I'd lost the race. I wouldn't get by them again. They'd pull away on the straight and I wouldn't see them. So whatever happened, I had to get into that first corner first. And in fact, people generally didn't believe the times. They thought it was a mistake. And how could this be? A wooden car, Abarth, and all their might and money behind them, and this unknown 22-year-old English driver who nobody heard of before. Not possible. Because in those days, the stopwatches were held by hand, and they did make errors. So nobody really believed the times. But nonetheless, I got pole position. And for a change, I made a very good start, which I didn't always do. I got just the right amount of wheel spin and got the thing moving. And initially, I out-accelerated the Abarth because I had less weight. The whole car only weighed 350 kilograms, which is about the same as a big motorbike. So it was extremely light. So I out-dragged the Fiat initially, but as we got to over 100 miles an hour, his extra power began to tell, and he started to get in front of me. I can see the braking sign coming up for the first right-hand bend, which I had to get into. And by this time, I looked from my periphery vision, I could see this Abarth, this red Abarth, creeping forward almost ahead of me. We passed the braking point, the normal braking point, and we're still accelerating. But neither of us would give way. All of a sudden, he'd gone. He put the brakes on. I was first into the corner, but far too quick. I mean, it went into a slide, and I thought, hello, it's going to go. It drifted and drifted around, and I've got full lock, I've got full opposite lock. I can't, on my fingertips, I can't get any more lock. I'm tickling the throttle to try and keep the thing from going into a spin. At the same time, I had a split-second look in the mirror, and the cars behind me, the Abarths in particular, backed off, because they thought, I'm going to have one monumental accident, and they didn't want to be involved. But I held it. It went right to the edge of the circuit. It didn't come off. I held it, and I zoomed off down the next straight, and they never saw me again. I finished up in the lead by a huge margin and won the race outright. Came back into the start-finish line, usual thing, champagne and cups and bouquets of flowers from very pretty young ladies. And the thing we didn't do in those days, we didn't shake the champagne and squirt it over people, we drank it. It was lovely. I mean, I wasn't a drinker at the time, never touched alcohol, but when you win a motor race, you're presented with a great big silver bowl as a trophy, and ice-cold champagne's in there. Believe me, it tastes fantastic. Anyway, so that was all very well, and then we had a lap of honour. I had one girl sitting with her legs over my shoulders, another pretty girl on the seat next to me, all the cars blowing their hooters. It was really fantastic, wonderful feeling. It came back into the paddock, and then Dr. Moloff came over, looking a bit down in the mouth. And I said, what's the matter, doctor? He said, the Fiat team manager, Senor Avedano, has put in the complaint that our car is illegal. I said, well, how so illegal? I said, what are the grounds of the complaint? He said, the windscreen is illegal. I said, okay. I said, well, let's get the FIA yearbook out and have a look at the regulations. And I remember exactly what they said. It said the windscreen material shall be of safety glass, which is laminated glass. But we didn't. We had a perspex screen on, which is much lighter, because Frank was very terribly weight conscious from the aircraft industry. So we had a perspex screen, but it went on, should be made of safety glass or of a material specified by the manufacturer. Well, I was the manufacturer. and I specified perspex. So in that sense, the regulations were ambiguous. And meanwhile, the stewards, because of this ambiguity, they couldn't make up their minds what to do. They couldn't rule. So I'd already had the prize money, which I wasn't going to give them back. But they wouldn't give me the cup. Instead, they referred the matter to the FAA in Paris. And then we had, for 6 months afterwards, we had letters going backwards and forwards to the FAA, and lawyers becoming involved on the legality of the car. And the outcome was, the FAA ruled in their wisdom, that I was the rightful winner of the race. I can keep the prize money, which I kept anyway, and I could have the cup, which Dr. Moloff gave to his daughter, and I never saw it again. But Abath could have the points. Now, this was a political settlement, and typical of the French at the time. The points I couldn't care less about. I wasn't running in the championship. I just wanted to win the race, to sell the car, or for Dr. Moloff to sell the cars. So I was quite happy with that. But you can see the politics behind it. The French siding with the Italians to give them points for the championship. And that's how it was in those days. I remember Colin Chapman taking his Lotus Elites, the team Elites to Le Mans, and they were trying to get the index of thermal efficiency, which the French wanted for themselves with their little Renaults or their Simcas, and they gave Chapman all sorts of problems, and they kept finding problems in scrutineering with the hubs and this and that, and he said he swore he would never go to Le Mans again, and he didn't. But I got a taste of that with this Abath incident, but for me it worked out fine. But these cars, I mean, the whole monocoque was made of wood, the front and rear sections were made of fiberglass. You can see the imp engine in the back turned over so it uses downdraft Webers, and they were amazing little cars. Well, you can see here, give you an idea, by that road bridge with the sort of tyre across it, you can see how far the Abaths were behind me. When the race was finished, in fact, you couldn't see them at all, won by a huge margin. And we set up the lap record as well. And a wonderful experience. In fact, we were so happy, I said to Tony the mechanic, I said, let's go to Paris tonight and spend some of this prize money and have a good time. We'll go to the Folies Bergère or something like that, and we went into Paris, and quite frighteningly, the prize money disappeared almost overnight. We did have a good time in Paris. The next step in the development of that car, we wanted to build a car to enter Le Mans for 1967. So Frank designed a roof and doors for it, and we called it the Costin Nathan GT. You can see the start of the 1967 race. That's the year that the Mark IV Fords won, with I think it was Dan Gurney or Parnelli Jones. And he beat the works for eyes. But a wonderful picture there. Another little story here. We had the running start, as you can see, charged across the track. Nobody put their seatbelts on because they were in a hurry to get started, although they were starting to use seatbelts by that time. I had a watch on, stainless steel watch, wristwatch, with a clasp, a pressure clasp. And as I jumped into my car, I must have twisted my wrist and the clasp opened. So what happened, when I put my hand on the gear lever, the watch fell over my hand and trapped it on the gear lever. I couldn't get my hand off. I mean, but all in all, it wasn't a very successful race. The car, in fact, was too new. We built the car, and it was finished 3 weeks before the race. And I thought, it's cutting it a bit fine. We haven't tested the car yet. Should I cancel the entry? So to make my mind up, I thought, we'll go and have a test day at Snetterton and see how the car performs. If it performs well, we'll go ahead. If we've got problems, I'll just cancel the entry. Went to Snetterton. We had a hack engine in the car giving minimal horsepower. We did 75 laps, faultless laps. It never missed a beat, and it shattered the lap record with this hack engine. So I thought, well, right, if we go to Le Mans, if we don't win, and we wanted to win the index of thermal efficiency, which was very much sought after, at least we're going to put on a good show. But when we got to Le Mans, we got through scrutineering without a problem, which is unusual with the French. We got through because we carefully checked all the points, the windscreen sizes and door measurements and openings and depths of things and heights. It was all fine, so they couldn't find a fault. And as soon as we went out to practice, we had all sorts of problems. We had a misfire, an intermittent misfire, which would come and go. It was very hard to trace. We couldn't trace it. And we had aerodynamic problems. Because down the straight at Le Mans, you've got a 3-mile straight. And you know, even with the 1-litre engine, with that streamlined body, we're getting up to 150 miles an hour when it wasn't misfiring. But that's something else. At Le Mans, at night and in the rain, there's no lights on the main roads. There's no lights. And we're doing 150 miles an hour, which we've reached probably halfway down the straight. We're just signaling at this speed. It wouldn't go any faster. And then you see these lights twinkling in the mirror, and they're getting bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden, boom! The Ford Mark IV went by doing 230 odd miles an hour. I mean, and you get sucked into the slipstream. You can feel the car being pulled over. It was quite interesting. But we had a 70 mile an hour speed difference. We fitted a back cover over the carburetors because we thought the air was being sucked out in the vacuum. That did help the problem, but we couldn't actually cure this misfire. And Lucas, who actually came down with special wire from Birmingham to wire the car for us free of charge, were there, and they couldn't find it. And we never cured it, in fact. And we raced for about 4 hours, but it became dangerous because with the misfire we couldn't keep the speeds up, and the speeds were too much differential on the straights between the faster cars. So I withdrew the entry. So Le Mans was in many ways a disaster, particularly after the success of Montlhéry. All the good work we did for Montlhéry was lost at Le Mans, or most of it. But the strange thing was, and the ironic thing was, when Lucas came down and offered to wire the car for us, they came down with a special high-quality aircraft standard wire. We had a much better copper or something inside it, with cloth and another covering over the cloth. And it was that wire that was the problem. It was a fault in the ignition circuit. That wire had a break, which was a manufacturing fault. It was just sheer bad luck in that piece of wire. And sometimes it would make contact, depending if it was going right or left-hand corner, or if the temperature was right, it would contact. If it got cold, it would part again. And this was this intermittent misfire. And what it was a faulty wire. Had we used the standard loom, which we normally use, with the plastic cover wire, it probably would have been fine. But a small thing like that, it really spoiled the race. Oh, right. This is another version of the GT, which we built with a 2-litre BMW in, because we wanted more outright wins. And this car was built for a customer who asked me to test it for him. So I thought, what better way to test it than take it to a race at Brands Hatch, which I did in May 1968. Won outright, again the lap record, handed the car over to the customer. At least in something like that, you can't come back and say the car's no good, so I just won a race in it. So that car is still around, in fact. It was bought some years later as a wreck in the 70s by Harm Lagai. Harm Lagai was head of design of BMW, and later he was with Porsche as head of design for 13 years. He rebuilt the car, and I bought it back from him in the late 80s. I brought it back to the UK. That car's still around. I can't think where it is now, but it still exists. This was at the Nürburgring in 1968, again in the Costin Nathan, the GT, the 1 litre, won outright with the new lap record. I remember in that event taking the mechanics round, each of the 2 mechanics, Nick Cole and Dave Wesley, for a lap. And that Nürburgring in those days, there were no guardrails, and you were racing around the mountains through forests, and it was quite dangerous, in fact. And there were several bumps which you went over, blind bumps, and you'd actually lift off, you'd be a foot in the air as you passed over these bumps, and you'd come down and try and keep the car straight. And we hit a patch of oil on one of the very fast bends, which wasn't there on the last lap of the race. And I didn't know it was there, so it hit this patch of oil, and the car slid frontally towards the edge, and a sheer drop over the side, down into the woods. Luckily, it stopped just on the edge. And so, but I think poor Nick must have been quite afraid. But it was all right, no harm done. That's the GT car you can see with the roof on, with the model lying on top, which was a thing we did in those days to attract attention, although today it would be called sexist, it wouldn't be popular. But the other car, the Oldham car, is a successor to the Costin Nathan. It was called the Astra, because I parted with Frank at this time, because we fell out for various reasons. And we built the Astra, which was, again, very successful. In fact, that monocoque, Frank's design, lasted for 5 years competitively, and that would never happen today. So it shows how clever he was with his design. And here, in this bottom picture here, this model, I remember her name very well, Diane McNeil. You can see that somebody on the right-hand side of the picture, they're looking at her. That was Cedric Silzer, our mechanic. Well, in fact, he was he was Jimmy Clark's mechanic with Team Lotus. When he left Team Lotus, he joined us to build the Astras, and he was very good indeed. Part of that car is his design. This again is the Astra at Crystal Palace, where I won both heats of the British Road Services trophy race, and again got the lap record. That's another of our staff there, Pat Mackey, who unfortunately I've lost contact with. I don't know where he is now. He came from Reading. I've not seen him since those days. This was the penultimate car we built. You can see how it's developed with the wider wheel arches, the wider wheels. We've now got a proper rollover bar with a lateral support and a closed helmet. That was at Hamlina in Finland. But I wasn't very well there, and we had a wheel bearing problem and it didn't do so well. This is the prototype that won at Montlhéry. It was sold at the end of the season to somebody called Jeff Horsley, who was a bit of an eccentric, lived in Manchester. And Chris Meek drove the car, and then Horsley just kept the car in the garage for 45 years, an unheated garage. And this was in 2006, I went to see it. As you can see, it's just a pile of junk. It's rusted, all the metal's corroded away, the alloy wheels are corroded, the wood is full of woodworm and rot and mould. But that car went to auction at H&H. It made an amazing price at the auction. And that, in fact, is the car that was at Beaulieu up until last year, the Red Sports racing car. I totally restored it over 3 years, and it was on show here. That was the car in the auction. Horsley put a roof on and doors, which I supplied, tried to make it into a GT. And then
next lot.
This is the beginning of the auction.
It's the Costin Nathan. I know a lot of you have been waiting for this particular vehicle to go under the hammer. The Costin Nathan. We do have an announcement. This applies to the people on the telephone as well as the people on the internet, and obviously for you ladies and gentlemen within the room. Roger Nathan is actually here.
I'm amazed at the interest in the car. I mean, as far as I was concerned, it was it is a wreck basically. And I thought, nobody's going to want to be interested in that car. So I'm very surprised at that, but I mean, having come here and seen the interest, I'm really amazed.
18,000, 20,000 still with me on commission, I'm afraid, against you on the internet. 22,000, my commission's out at £22,000 with Will on the World Wide Web.
We met up with Frank Costin, and he became very interested in our lightweight imp engine that we were producing at the time. So Frank, being very much weight orientated, thought that was the ideal engine for his new sports car. Frank came rushing down with his son Ronnie the day before the preview with just a bare monocoque and chassis on wheels. It wasn't even painted. Worked all afternoon, all night on the car, had the painters in, got it on the trailer the sort of crack of dawn, drove it to central London and got it into the Dorchester Hotel with some difficulty through the back entrance. The paint was still drying. By the time we got in, it was dry. And it looked fantastic. And that was the car that's here at the auction tonight.
34,000, still with Will on the internet, at 34,000. 36,000, back in the room at £36,000 on the Costin Nathan.
It immediately won. It was fast, it broke that records wherever we went. But the best race was probably against the Works Fiat A-Bath at Montlhéry, the banked autodrome just outside Paris. And Johan Altner was their leading driver. And they were doing very well in the... I'll stop this here, folks, because you've heard that story. I don't want to bore it with you a second time. That's the car here at Beaulieu restored. You can see the there's a huge difference between the wreck and how it is after. How are we doing for time now? Oh, okay. I think we've got to stop for an interval now, ladies and gentlemen. 8:30.
Just before we stop, Roger's got books here for those who want to see the whole story over the period of time. I'll ask him just to give you a quick resume of the type of book he's got here for sale. So if you want to get more information, you're going to have to part with your money.
Well, it's not that bad. Basically, there are two books. There's the racing book, which concerns 10 years of my rotor racing. A lot of the stories that I've just told you, and a lot more that I haven't, because there isn't the time or to go into too much detail. This is the first edition. It used to go for £30. It's now 10 because it's no longer in print. There's the second edition of that book, which is much improved, modern cover, a lot more pictures, and much better definition on the print and the pictures. And there's something else here. This is the third book, which is very little to do with motor racing, hardly anything at all. This is about life after motor racing. When I became involved in 2 civil wars, when I started flying, one in the Middle East and the other in West Africa. I also started an airline in West Africa during the Civil War there, which in fact was highly successful. This includes things like diamond mining. I lived in the bush for a year in the tent on the side of the Baffy River. I was the only white man for 200 miles mining diamonds. Quite successfully. It was very interesting, although I didn't know a great deal about it. A bit like motor racing. But it reads, I mean, it's had some fantastic reviews. It reads like a script from an Indiana Jones movie. The difference being is it's all true and factual. So if you're not interested in motor racing, you might like to read a great yarn. And in fact, Max Mosley, just before he died, he signed the foreword for me. And the other books have been signed on the foreword by Bernie Eccleston, my old family friend. These are £10, the Series 1. The Series 2 are £20. And this one, a hardback, is £30. And if you want them signed, it's a £5 or a £10 extra. So I'll pass it over to you, John.
Right. Thank you very much. As I said at the start, a fascinating story to start with, and you've only just heard the tip of it. Now, I'd like back in here by 9 o'clock, please. So if you'd like to go, and the drinks are pre-ordered drinks are laid out, and those that want to get to the bar, well, you know where it is. Okay, see you all at 9 o'clock.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. How do you think?
Very good.
Really?
Very good.
What time do you want to stop, basically?
10 to 10, and then you can do questions.
All right. Well, that should be fine, because, yes.
Will you get it all in?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay. Right, shall we start again? Those who haven't got your books, Roger will be selling them afterwards if you want the next instalment. So, over to you, Roger.
Right, thank you, John. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we're pretty much finished with motor racing now. One final picture to show you. This is an Elva FJ, a Formula Junior. It's called the FJ200. They were built in Hastings by Elva Cars, which was basically, can't remember his name now, but they're built in Hastings. This was a car that Bernie Eccleston had. Unfortunately, my father bought. Bernie was a friend of the family. And I think it was the worst thing he ever did to me. I mean, it had drum brakes and 15-inch wheels, and all the opposition had 13-inch wheels and disc brakes, to give you some idea. So it wasn't a very competitive car. I think I won 1 or 2 races with it and came second a couple of times. But then going down the straight at Snetterton, past the pits, again at probably 120 miles an hour, the steering began to feel very vague and it was wandering all over the place. Next lap I pulled into the pits and found that the steering brackets holding the rack in place, with the welding had broke and the steering was about to come adrift from the chassis. So I thought, that's enough of this elbow, I've got to get rid of this. And luckily I sold it to a chap called Keith Holland, who had Windsor Garage in West Malling in Kent. And he took it over from there. But forgetting the elbow, if you look to the right, you can see an Aston Martin DB4 GT there. Well, that was my brother's car, his road car, or one of his road cars, and it had dual ignition and triple Weber carburetors. It was a lightweight, and they were a very, very rare car. And I drove that down to Snetterton with my brother as well on holiday without his knowledge, which I shouldn't have done, but I did. And it was doing 9 miles per gallon. It was terrible. And handling was just awful. You put your foot on the brake, it was like staying on a concrete block. There was no feel at all. It wouldn't stop. It just would not stop. It went all right, but you couldn't stop it. Anyway, that car today, I think we bought it from West Salvador, and we paid, or he paid £3,000 for it. Today, that car is probably worth something like 3 million. I mean, it's a horrible car to drive. It's awful. But anyway, moving on from that, we're going to the next stage of my life. Aha, right. A bit different from motor racing, and probably in some ways more dangerous. I think I better start from the beginning, otherwise I'm going to confuse you and confusing myself at the same time. When I stopped motor racing after 10 years in 1970, I had a race at Silverstone, the Automotive Products Trophy race, which I won, still haven't let record, and then I just stopped motor racing. I turned my back and walked away from it. And I thought, well, what do we do next after motor racing? I certainly couldn't go and get a sort of normal job. It didn't seem to fit my ticket. So I thought, I'll start flying. That's a good idea. I had an uncle in the Air Force during the war, on Lancasters. My brother was in the Air Force doing his national service. I've always had an interest in aircraft, so I thought, I'll go and get my pilot's license. I went up to Elstree in North London and signed on for the course, got my PPL, and then I got a multi-engine rating, then an instrument rating, a night rating, and I started buying and selling aircraft. I bought some Beagle Bassets from the RAF, or the Ministry of Defence, when they sold them off, disbanded the squadron and sold them off. And I kept one for myself, which I had for a long time, 7 years. And there's a story attached to this aircraft. After 7 years, I thought I'd sell it and get something else. So I placed an advert in Flight International, which was the magazine to sell aircraft in those days. A bit like Autosport was with cars. You had a racing car for sale, you put it in Autosport. And after a couple of weeks, I had a call from somebody called Gabby from Paris and said, could I bring the Beagle over to Paris so he can see it, and if he likes it, he'll buy it. So I said, well, not really, Gabby, because if you want to buy the plane, you have to come to England. Because I knew what could happen. You go to Paris, you spend £500 on fuel, plus your en route charges and your parking charges, and you end up spending £700-800. He tries the plane, burns up more fuel, says he doesn't like it, and then, goodbye, Roger. So I said, no, if you want to come to England, you can fly the plane here, and I'd be delighted to show you all the books and the log books and the history of the aircraft and everything else. He said, well, I can't, I'm too busy. I said, if you're too busy, when you've got more time, ring me and we'll talk again. I just forgot about it. 3 weeks later, same chap he phoned back, this time he's in Brussels. And he said the same thing, can I take the aircraft to Brussels? I said, well, we've been through this before. I said, if you want it, you must come to the UK. And he said, well, I can't. He said, I'm just starting a new freight airline in Ostend, and I'm very busy. And I said, oh, okay. So I became more interested then, and we started chatting. And I thought, this fellow is serious. He could be a buyer. Especially when he told me he also flies a Boeing 707 for King Hussein of Jordan, the King's private aircraft. And I questioned him some more, and he certainly came up with the right answers. He made a lot of sense. So I thought, I'll take a chance. I said, all right, Gabby, I'll meet you at Brussels tomorrow at the information desk at the airport. I'll pack in all the spares, all the logbooks, all the other bumps that goes with an aircraft. I'll see you sort of 2 o'clock or whatever, 3 o'clock. Went to Elstree. No, in fact it wasn't, it was Leavesden. Went to Leavesden near Watford, because the Elstree runway wasn't long enough to take off in the Beagle if you had full tanks. So I kept it at Leavesden, which was much longer. Flew to Brussels, met Gabby. Seemed like a very affable fellow, nice guy, and we had a few beers and we started talking, and he asked to see the logbooks and aircraft documents. I showed him those, and he said, without looking at the aircraft, fine, I'll buy it. He hasn't even looked at the aircraft, he didn't want to see the aircraft, just the papers. I said, oh, okay, I said, fine. He said, I can give you some cash now and the balance by cheque. Okay, so we said, how much cash? And I said, okay, that's fine. And I said, where's the cheque drawn on? And he said, it was a Lebanese bank somewhere in Brazil, South America. So I thought, am I doing the right thing here? And he said, well, one thing, he said, now I've bought the plane, could you fly me to Nice tonight? I want to meet my wife there, my future son-in-law. So I thought, aha, that sounds a bit better. I can quickly go to the bank, special the cheque, have control of the aircraft and fly him to Nice, give it a bit more time for the cheque to clear. So we ended up flying to Nice. A bit embarrassing, we're up at about 6,000 feet. It's night time and now it's pitch hot, freezing cold, and the heater packs up, which is very embarrassing. Never packed up before, but these things do happen. We landed at Nice at about midnight, met his wife and his son-in-law-to-be, went into Nice for a pizza at 1 o'clock in the morning, and during the meal he said to me, would you mind taking me a bit further tomorrow? He said, I'll pay your expenses and your ticket back to the UK. I said, well, fine, Gabby. I said, where do you want to go? He said, I want to go to Athens. I said, Athens, fine, we'll go to Athens. I said, good, more time for the cheque to clear. I love flying. And flying with Gabby, it turned out he was 44 years old and he had 24,000 hours in his logbook. I mean, that's a huge amount of hours. And people spend their life in the Air Force and come up with 7,000 hours. So, and it was very interesting flying with him, so I was learning a lot. And he was, we were becoming friends, he was very affable. Anyway, so we get to Nice. We take off at dawn the following day as the sun comes up on the runway. We're heading to Athens. We had to stop at Naples for fuel. And we got to Athens quite late in the evening. I'm pretty tired by this time. And it turned out he was the senior captain of the Middle East Airlines. He had number I think, 2 license in Lebanon. This was in 1976. And he said, okay, he said, come down to the drink, come down to the bar rather, we'll have a drink together now we've landed. And the last thing I do was wanted to drink or anything else. I wanted to go to bed and sleep because I'd been flying for 2 days solid and almost 2 nights, and I was very tired. He wouldn't touch the aircraft, he wouldn't fly it at all. I asked him why, and he said, well, his contract wouldn't allow him to fly any plane, any aircraft that wasn't owned by Middle East Airlines. I said, well, fine, okay, I don't mind flying it. Anyway, we got to Athens, and I thought, it can't be unsociable, so I freshened up and came down for a drink, and met him in the bar, and he's got this stunning-looking lady with him at the bar. And I remember seeing her and thinking, wow, this is something else. It turns out she was a stewardess who worked with Gabby on the flights that the Saudis, the Saudis, the royal family used to use these Middle East airlines for their flights. They used to hire aircraft to take their family on holiday, for example, to America. They'd charter a 747 for the family. And she would go on those flights because she spoke 5 languages fluently and great personality. And Gabby would normally do that kind of flying. So we're chatting away, and I thought, a very interesting young lady. And Gabby said to me, he said, by the way, he said, one more thing, can you do me another favour? I said, yes, Gabby, what would you like? He said, well, can we go on to Cyprus tomorrow? So I said, yes. He said, same deal. He said, you're on expenses and I'll pay your ticket back and all this and that and the other. And I said, I was having a good time. So I said, yes, I'll come to Cyprus, certainly. So the next day we take off very early again. And we're getting close to Cyprus. I made contact with Cyprus air traffic control and said we were inbound. And then I hear Gabby muttering on the intercom. I said, "What is it, Gabby?" And he was hesitant, which he wasn't normally. And I thought, what's he talking about? And I suddenly realised he doesn't want me to go to Cyprus anymore. He wants to go somewhere else now. So I said, "What is it, Gabby?" He said, he said, "I want to go somewhere else." I said, "Well, where do you want to go?" He said, "Further east." So I'm thinking, further east, we've got Turkey, and we've got Russia. I said, where do you want to go? Well, he said, "I want to go to Lebanon." I said, "Lebanon?" I said, "We can't go there." I said, "There's a war on there." I said, the rebels have got the airport. It's been closed for a year or more now. He said, "I know that." And I said, "Well, we can't find a flight plan there. It won't be accepted. And B, we've already told Larnaca we're going to land there." And he said, "Well, what you do is this. You call up Larnaca, tell them you want to cancel the flight plan and refile for Damascus." I said, "Okay." I said, "Where are we going to Damascus?" He said, "Well, we're going nearby the Damascus. It's just up the road from Anyway, so I called up air traffic control at Larnaca, cancelled the flight plan and refile for Damascus. And then I turned east. So he said, "Look, drop below 1,000 feet so we go off their radar and we can be rid of them then. And then we're going to land in Lebanon." I said, "Well, where are we going to land in Lebanon? Because the airport's shut." "Oh," he said, "I'm working with the Christian militia and we prepared a special airport just north of Beirut at a place called Juni, which is a port. And they had a huge casino there, a favourite place for the wealthy Arabs to go, the sheiks, when they wanted to escape from their own strict regimes, religious regimes. And there was gambling, all sorts of things there. A very nice place, lovely yachts and things in the harbour. Anyway, so we drop below 1,000 feet and we start heading east now. We're going directly to Lebanon. And you can see the Lebanese mountains in the distance. They go up to about 6,000 feet. And interestingly, they got snow on top. There, you can swim in the sea in the mornings. It's warm, lovely and warm. Up the mountain and ski in the afternoon. It's very unusual. I don't know anywhere else in the world you can do that. Anyway, I said, "No, you have to be careful here because if you go too far to the right, you're liable to get a rocket from the rebels in the airport in Beirut." And he said, "Don't go too far to the left because you'll have a Syrian MiG after us." So I'm thinking, have I done the right thing here? Anyway, he's in the aeroplane, I'm in the aeroplane, his wife's in there, his son-in-law to be, and all the spares, and we're heavy with fuel because there's no fuel was available in Lebanon. The airport was shut. Anyway, and he said, we've got this special place we prepared with the Christian militia, and we're going to land there. And he said, "Head for those two peaks and aim to land between them." And so we got closer, and there's a road running from Beirut north into a town. And it's a right-angle bend. There was a big building on the left-hand side of this bend, which was some sort of utility house for electricity, a power station of some sort. Then the road went into the town. He said, "Fly over the town and orientate yourself for a landing." I said, "Fine." So I go over the town. He said, "I go around there and look at the landing strip." I got the thing banked over. I'm looking down and looking down. I've gone around. I can't see anywhere to land. He said, "I'm going to go around." I said, "I'm going to go around again." He said, "What?" He said, "Like I said, I haven't seen the landing strip yet." So I went around again. I'm looking down. He said, "It's there. It's underneath you." And I got the thing banked over, and I can't see anywhere to land. All I can see is this single-track road running from the sea into the town. I said, I can't see the landing strip." He said, "Well, it's there. It's that road." I said, "What? Is that road?" I said, "But it's not long enough." I said, "It's very narrow. It's a single-track road." I said, "How long is it?" And he said, I think it was 2,500 feet or something. So I immediately pulled out the RAF manual from the pocket in the side to check at our weight if it's possible to land in that distance and stop. And it wasn't. We have a predicament here. I said, "Gabby, according to the manual, this cannot be done." And he said, "But I've checked it en route. I've watched you take off and land, and I've asked you to put full flap and maximum braking on and to see how quickly it stops and takes off on, and you can do it." Well, he was far more experienced than me. He's on board, his family's on board. So I have to believe him. There's nothing else to do, is there? I got myself into a tricky situation for a change. Anyway, so, okay, I have to land. Now, bearing in mind we're heavy, and you always land and take off into wind to reduce your ground speed. But because the mountains start the other side of the town, I couldn't get low enough to land into wind, which was towards the sea. So I had to land from the sea downwind, which made things even worse. So I'm going along, I've got the nose up with a lot of power on, a very slow speed just before the stall. I had to be very careful, because at 300 feet, if it stalls, you're not going to recover. But I couldn't land quickly because this building is on the corner, and it's blocking the road. So I had to get it under the wing before I could land. I saw it pass under the wing, I pulled the throttle back, and the aircraft just stopped like a brick. And I thought, this is going to smash on the runway. I've got to do something. Opened up both throttles fully, full power for about 2 seconds, eased them back, and it just touched down beautifully on the two main wheels. Put the nose wheel down, put the brakes on, and we tried to stop. I'm aware of these pylons and sentry boxes flashing by each wing, almost touching it, and there's soldiers there with guns and all sorts of weapons on them, and we're flashing down this road. And then suddenly Gabby yells through the headphones, "We're not stopping, we're not stopping." I said, we are stopping. But we weren't stopping, because the brakes were fading because of the heavy pedal pressure. And I was having to pump the brakes to keep the pressure there. I kept pumping the brakes, the throttles were closed, and we actually stopped a great pile of smoking tires and red-hot brakes about 30 feet from a barrier into the town, which was a metal barrier across the road. And all of a sudden, hundreds of people are running towards us. They're all armed, they've got grenade belts on, carrying Kalashnikovs, some in military uniform. And I realised the props were still turning. And of course, you can't see them. And people don't realise that if they're in a crowd, they could run into the props and be chopped to pieces. So I killed the engines. Next thing I know, the military opened the door, we pulled it out of the aeroplane, put on their shoulders, and taken to a great cafe in the port for lunch. That was my introduction to Lebanon. And the militia then took charge of the aircraft and put a guard on it. And Gabby invited me back to his home to stay, or to recover, shall we say. And he showed me a very nice picture of him in the cockpit of the King's Boeing 707, King Hussein's Boeing, and him and the King flying this Boeing together. Very nice guy. And he said to me, "Would you mind staying a bit longer in Lebanon?" I said, "Well, to do what?" He said, "Well, I want to start an air service between the runway at Juni and Larnaca." So he said, "I'll put you on a salary and you can stay with me." And we've become quite friendly by now, and I was having a thoroughly good time. I loved the flying, it was challenging, to the point of being ridiculous. And I said, "Okay, we'll do it." So the first trip comes along, and I said, "Gabby, it's very hot here. In these sort of temperatures, we need to take off early in the morning when it's cool, because the engines will have more power, and this runway is very short." So, as it turns out, the first day came, and of course it didn't happen at 9 o'clock. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the hottest time, we're ready for takeoff. The worst possible time of the day, temperature's right up, and this family gets on board, masses of boxes. It was a sunny sight. I remember the head of this family, he was standing on this dusty road in a bowler hat and a white pinstripes, black and white pinstripes City of London suit with a rolled umbrella. It looked strange. It was like some sort of strange dream. Anyway, he happened to be the head of a company that imported all the Caterpillar machines to the Middle East, and he wanted it out of Lebanon. So they climbed on board, loads of baggage, and I thought, well, we want every inch of this runway that we can. So I asked Gabby to tell the militia to push the aircraft back against the barrier to give us every inch of runway. And I thought, normally you take off with, say, 15 degrees of flap. You've seen it when you take off on the scheduled jets, you've got flap on. But with the flap on, you've also got drag. So I thought, I'll take off with zero flap initially and lower the drag when the speed builds up. Lower the flaps when the speed builds up to give us more time. And also, because the Beagle had engines rotating the same way, instead of contra-rotating, it would tend to veer in that direction of rotation. And you had to correct that by pushing the right brake pedal to keep the aircraft straight on the runway till enough speed built up for the rudder to take effect. So, but I daredn't do that because once you dab the brakes, you're knocking 5 or 6 miles an hour off the speed, and we didn't have the runway to spare. So full power, release the brakes, the thing surges forward. I'm watching the airspeed indicator build up. It gets to 60 knots, a lower 15 degrees of flap. In the meantime, I'm trying to keep it straight. I'm standing on the right pedal, stop it swinging left, always standing in the seat pushing this right pedal to keep it straight. I daren't touch the brakes. And then the rudder began to take effect, about 70 knots. And by this time, a lot of the runway has disappeared, and we're coming towards the end of it. And we've still got 3 wheels on the ground. And it's too late to stop. There's no way to stop in time. You've gone beyond the point of no return. So Gary said, lift off, lift off. I said, no, we can't, it's too soon. We need 85 knots. I knew if we took off at 80 knots, it wouldn't maintain, it'll come down again. If it did that, we're finished. We had to reach 85 knots if I would pull the stick back enough to take off. And in those situations, you can see this needle come out. It's like watching a boiling kettle. It never seems to happen. And the speed is building up. Eventually, we get to 85 knots. I lift the nose wheel up, pull the stick back, lift the nose wheel. By this time, this utility building, this generating building, is really big in the windscreen. I mean, it's huge. And beyond that, you've got the road, and after the road, you've got massive rocks, which they use to break up the waves, like a water break. So there's nowhere to go, nowhere to stop. So you just had to go on. I pulled the stick back at 85 knots. It took off, and it stabilised. It didn't continue to climb. Then I thought, oh, it's going to come down. And I started to shake the stick to sort of balance it and try and stop it coming down. I don't know why I did that. It's just something I felt I should do, and it worked. Meanwhile, I had a quick look at Gabby, and he's sitting there bathing in sweat, the sweat pouring off him. And the passengers in the back drinking their coffee and cakes, they had no idea the drama going up front at all. I mean, thank God they didn't, poor souls. Anyway, by this time the building was coming towards me, so I had to turn the aircraft at almost 0 feet to avoid the building, lift the undercarriage, and then gradually the aircraft began to climb slowly, and we pulled away, and we got safely to Larnaca. That was my first experience taking off there, and I can tell you it was very hairy. Anyway, eventually there were complaints from certain factors in the Middle East that we were doing these flights, and they wanted them stopped. So we couldn't land at Larnaca any longer. Although we were on this occasion able to because of the status of the passengers that we carried. It was permitted. But in the end, I spent some weeks there making this flight regularly. In the end, I was even doing it at night in total darkness. There were no lights. But I knew the plane very well. I had it for 7 years, like your car. You know exactly what you can do and how long it'll take to stop if you've had a car a long time. And I found that with the aeroplane. And to come in at night, they would put 2 cars across the beginning of the runway where this blockhouse was and shine the lights across the runway. And that's the point I'd aim for. And I could land and stop, and it was fine. Well, it wasn't fine, but I could do it. And then it became time to go. So Gary said, I've got a Jordanian pilot. Can you train him? So I said, yeah, okay. Yeah. He said, well, take the aircraft and the pilot to Rhodes and train him, and he'll take over from you, and he'll drop you at Athens. And you can continue there back by scheduled flight. I said, fine. Did the training. I remember the chap, his name was a nice fellow, a young guy called Joseph El Oster, an Arabic guy. But unfortunately, he killed himself, not in this aircraft, somewhere else. He flew into a mountain in Saudi some years later and killed himself. I don't know the details. And I flew back to London on a scheduled flight. But I actually came back at a later time to bring the aircraft out of the Middle East. It was stuck in Larnaca. Apparently, Gary was trying to get a Belgian pilot to fly it out empty. And the pilot took off empty from Junie, and he frightened himself so much he abandoned the aircraft in Larnaca. He said, I don't want to know, I'm going back to Belgium. So Gary asked me to bring back the aircraft from Belgium, which I did. And eventually I ended up buying the aircraft back from him. But the end of the story is that young lady I met at the bar in Athens that night ended up becoming my wife sometime later. She now lives in England. This is our son here, our son Paul, who, unlike me, is clever. He takes after his mother, thank goodness. Right, anyway, so I enjoyed my time in Lebanon. It was interesting, met some great characters, had a good time. It was time to move on. And in the 1990s, in fact, before that, in the 1980s, I went to Sierra Leone to look at buying gold, because my wife started a business in London when the gold price went up from $50 an ounce to $1,000, and people were selling their jewellery, charm bracelets and things, as scrap, because it was worth it. It was $1,000 an ounce, and she was doing very well. And a lot of our customers came from West Africa. They were indigenous people, and they bought the gold to England. And I said, "Are you happy with the price we're giving you?" They said, "Yes." And I said, "Well," where do you get this gold from? I said, "We buy it from the villages and the mining areas." So I thought, well, if they can do that, I can do that. So we cut out the middleman and make a bit more profit. So we decided to go to Sierra Leone and try our hand at gold buying. And my wife, being Lebanese, Armenian Lebanese, she had connections there with the Lebanese community who more or less controlled the economy there. So we had introductions, and we hired a Benz and a guide and went to an area called Tonkalili, or as I called it, Auntie Lily, but Tonkalili, which was a very good area for buying gold, mining area. And I'd been to Hatton Garden prior to that and bought some balancing scales and acid to test that it really was gold, not lead, covered in gold paint. And we went to the village, and I was told the protocol was to go and see the village chief first and get his permission before you try to buy from the local people, because without his permission, they won't talk to you. So we sat in this hut. There was a tin hut with a tin roof rather than a mud hut, and the chief was there. And he wouldn't look at us. He turned his face away. I thought, that's a bit unfriendly. Then the guy gave me a nudge, and he said, he wants his present. Oh, I said, oh, I see. And we'd anticipated this, so we brought with us a box of expensive-looking imitation gold Rolex watches and things like that. So he said, here we are, Chief. I said, here's a box of nice watches. Choose one for yourself. Immediately his attitude changed. He smiled. I remember he had two huge gold teeth in his mouth. He chose the watch, and then he gave us permission to deal with the people. So we went outside and we started buying gold in little packages, which was very time-consuming. It wasn't cost-effective. It was dangerous because it meant you're in the bush, you're carrying large amounts of money around, and it's taking forever to buy gold because you've got to bargain with each person separately. So this is not going to work. So I said to the people, how do you get this gold? So they took me to the riverside, and basically the men were digging the gravel from the riverbank, put it into a thing called a calabash, which is like a gold pan, but it's a fruit they have there with a hard skin, so it acts like a gold pan. The women wash it on the river's edge and extract the gold in dust form. So I thought, well, the obvious thing to do here is to have a mechanised operation. Because, we can't work all day long to a few grams of gold. Came back to London, went to the geological division of Imperial College in London, and saw the head of the division there, Professor Buchanan, a South African. I explained what I wanted to do, and he put me in touch with a chappie called George Warner Norris, very nice fellow, who was a gold miner and prospector of considerable success and well known. And I was living in Highgate at the time. He lived in Hampstead, so we met up for a beer or two on a Sunday morning. We got on very well, and he agreed to come with me on a 3-month contract to show me how to mine gold. So Derek and I flew out, and with the next Scots Guard Army sergeant, who was going to be our manager to keep the labour under control, and he showed us how to go about mining. He wrote a report, and on the basis of that report, I then bought a machine from California a dredging machine, and the idea was to take this dredge, put it on this river in the eastern province of Sierra Leone, and you have a pipe which goes down, and you're vacuuming, you're sucking up the gravel from the bottom of the river, which contains the gold, rather like a vacuum cleaner. And then you take it ashore and you process it, and you extract the gold. Well, this was fine, but it didn't work out quite right. We couldn't make it, the figures tally according to Derek's calculations. Then we found out the machine was no good at all. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to. I then sued the makers in California, and they settled out of court. And I then went back to to what was then British Guyana, because they have big dredges there, commercial dredges. But I wouldn't buy one until I seen it operate. So I asked the maker to take me up the Mazaruni River to where his dredges were working to see these things in operation, which he did. I remember he packed a 38 caliber revolver, and we went off in a speedboat up the Mazaruni River. Saw these dredges working and realised it was quite different to the one I had, ordered one, and that was then sent out to Sierra Leone. I started the dredging operation on the Baffy River, and it was quite successful. We mined gold and diamonds, but it was fraught with problems because the local people, there were different chiefdoms, and we were dredging on one side, and another chieftain on the other side, and they said we had out with our long pipe, we were sucking from their side of the river. So we'd have all sorts of disputes and demarcation disputes. And they became quite violent in the end, and people were turning up with rifles and things and threatening to cut the ropes that held the dredge in place so it would drift downstream. I remember one day it got so serious I had to jump in the boat back to the car, down the river, back to the car, and come out with about 40 policemen with tear gas to control the mobs. But we got over that. This all happened over New Year's, spoilt my New Year's Day. But we got over that. And it was overall quite a successful operation. And that was in the 80s, early 80s. And then in the 1990s, the Civil War started. And what was happening, the roads were closed by government because the rebels were stopping cars travelling up country, locking them, and setting the cars on fire with the people inside. So nobody could use the roads, which meant all the diamond dealers and the miners up country couldn't get their goods down to Freetown on the coast. So what was needed was an air bridge. And this was at the time when the Soviet Union was collapsing. So I flew to Belarus and bought 2 Antonov biplanes, there's one there, and another one, and I flew them down to West Africa. And I started an internal airline called African Air Charter, flying people from Freetown to the provinces. And it was very successful. We flew the president, all the government ministers. We flew Baroness Chalker around when she came to West Africa. We did some work for the insurance companies, and it was very interesting. But as you can see, it's there was a problem with security all the time. And I was on a flight once to the diamond area with somebody who was very well known in Lebanon, Lebanese, who chartered the plane. And we got a call over the radio from the Inspector General of Police in Freetown, ordering us to come back to Hastings. The base there was called Hastings, an XR airfield from World War II. That's where we were based. And I said, we've got to go back because the Inspector General said we have to return. So we returned, landed there, and the army were all over the place with trucks and lorries and lots of soldiers, all very excited. And I was approached by Captain Tom Numa, one of it was a military government then. He was one of the leaders of the coup. And he said, there's a rebel attack at Kenema, which is the 3rd principal city in the Freetown, in Sierra Leone. And they were short of weapons and explosives and ammunition. And would I fly it out there? I said, well, I wasn't too keen on this. So I said, well, but you've got to be very careful, because when you're talking to the military in Africa and you don't do what they say, you can be in big trouble. I mean, you can get shot, they could confiscate the aircraft, they could do all sorts of things. And you can't argue with them, and you can't go to court, you forget that. So I didn't actually say no, but I didn't want to say yes either. And I said, Tom, who's going to pay for this flight? He said, the Ministry of Defence will pay. I said, oh yeah. I said, okay. So I quoted him a price. He said, we'll pay that. I said, fine. Then I approached the Russian crews, telling them what we had to do, and they refused. They said, no, we're here on a civilian contract. You know, we're not supposed to, we're not paid to fly these military roles. This aircraft needed a crew of 3. They wouldn't do it. So then I was in a predicament, because if I said no, I'd be in trouble with the army. So I took the flight myself. They loaded on 2 tons of explosives, grenades, all kinds of munitions, and I took off for Kenema. Landed there, offloaded everything. When I took off to come back to Freetown, I'm flying at 500 feet, climbing on full power, and all of a sudden I see this grey ring of smoke appear just in front of the aircraft. They're firing RPGs at me from the forest either side of the runway. So I thought, oh, we can't have this, so the best thing to do is turn around on full power and go back the other way, which I did. But it was very close. That RPG, had it hit the plane, it was only about 50 yards off. Had it hit the plane, it would have blown up. So I returned to Hastings, and but I did continue there for some time and run this airline. It went very well, in fact. But it was, you know, it was exciting all the time. It was, no 2 days were ever the same. That's the cockpit of the Antonov, and you can see there's all those red labels there. Well, being a Russian aircraft, of course, all the controls and the identification of them and the gauges were in Russian. I didn't understand Russian. So I went and bought some dynatapes at the local hardware store, and all the important instruments and switches, I labelled what they were. So I knew, like the fuel pumps and the magnetos and the throttles and things. I labelled all the important ones. The other ones I just left as they were. And I flew that out. It took me a week to fly to Freetown from Belarus and 2 days to cross the Sahara. But we got there. Next one. Oh yeah. This is on a place called Bont Island, in south of Sierra Leone. That's our security detail. Now, some of these soldiers were from an English company called Executive Outcomes, which in fact were based in Chelsea, on the King's Road in Chelsea. And that was a company operated by Simon Mann, who you've probably heard of. Simon Mann, he was the one who was detained in, what's the name of that country, Paul? And he was detained there for attempting a coup in where? Angola. No, not Angola, no. It was small. Where? No, near Rhodesia. Anyway, and they employed these mainly Namibian troops that we used to guard the aeroplane. In fact, there was a second plane that was flown out later, and then I bought a third plane from Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, which was a very nice twin jet engine aircraft, a turboprop with 21 seats. And I also flew that from, the Russian crew brought it to Hungary, and I flew it out with them to Africa. So we had 3 aircraft there. Come on, move over. Oh. Here we're flying in rice to the people who were hungry because of the war. They weren't getting their rice, and as you can see, they were very happy to see me in their 50-kilogram bags of rice. A plane full of them. Ah, that's my pet chimpanzee called Miss Babs. I had a friend in Manchester called Ron Porter, and his wife was Barbara. So I thought I'd name the chimpanzee after her and call the chimpanzee Babs. But I never told his wife, so I didn't think she'd appreciate it. And here we are. She's got her best shorts on. It's a Sunday morning. I've taken her out for a drink at a local beach bar. She liked to drink Fanta. You line the bottles up, the Coke, the Fanta, and she knew which one was Fanta. You take the Fanta bottle, take the top off with the teeth, and then pour it into a cup and drink it. And there's more there. I had several chimps there. I had all kinds of animals, chimps, and I had monkeys and deer in the compound. Lovely animals, very intelligent, but when they get bigger, they become very strong. You can't control them. I mean, they're 5 times stronger than we are, and they're very destructive. They root up the garden. They put them in the house, they pull the curtains down. They're incredible climbers. They can actually back onto a wall and go up a wall by clinging onto the wall somehow with their legs, because they've got this thumb on their foot. And if you wrestle with them, I used to wrestle with the chimp, and they do a backward somersault to get out of the grip. And it's like fighting somebody with 4 hands, because they've got this thumb on their foot. But she's quite small there. But a big male, I mean, you know, is very dangerous. Oh, that's the cover of the book. That's that you've seen there. Ah, this is slightly different now. That's a nuclear submarine at Faslane, HMS Vengeance. As you can see, it's quite a piece of kit. It's actually got 5 decks, but most of the decks are below water, and you can't see them. And you can see it's got that sort of matte black covering, where they're acoustic tiles, because they hunt each other, submarines, by sound. And that's used to deaden sound. But I got onto this sub as guest of the Navy. Quite a difficult thing to get onto. You go down a small stairway. I met the captain. I won't mention his name, other than it was Mark. And he took me on the guided tour of the ship. And interestingly, we went down through the 5 decks at the bottom, and there was this metal door on the floor. He said, "Roger," he said, "lift that plate up and have a look inside." So I pulled up this door. There's a piece of glass, probably a foot, at least a foot thick, and inside was a metal canister, about the size of a dustbin size, the old metal galvanized dustbins we used to have. And he said, "That is our nuclear reactor, and that will power this ship forever, basically. But we renew them every 25 years for health and safety reasons." This ship was 168 feet long, had a 150-old crew, and it had 16 nuclear missiles on board. I went to the control room, and he explained in detail how, under what conditions he will fire these missiles. I won't go into the details again because probably shouldn't, but it was very interesting. It's quite simple. It only requires one order to release those missiles. And each missile has 8 independently targetable warheads that go into geostationary orbit. I actually attended some lectures there on how they hunt each other. It was fascinating stuff. It really was. This is something I've always wanted to do, since having watched so many World War II films, and you see the U-boat pilots or captains looking into this periscope, and I always wondered what it's like to look into and see as they saw it. And then I finally got around to doing it in a nuclear submarine. Funny enough, I got the same jacket on. I think that's all we've got on here at the moment. We still have about 10 minutes. Have you got any time left, John? Or is it...
A few minutes. Do we have a few questions?
Well, I think so, yeah, because we want to get back over old ground. Although there's a lot more stories to tell, but I mean, this is going all night. I don't think we'll leave chimpanzees on there as a parting picture. Put something better on. Oh, no, another chimpanzee there. Leave that one there. Right.
Right. Do we have any questions for Roger? I'm sure somebody's got some. No, come on.
Why did you step away from motor racing?
Exactly. I knew that question was coming. People always ask that question. I said to John, I said over dinner,
yeah,
someone's going to ask that question.
yes.
Congratulations. Why did I stop? Well, I did it for 10 years. I was on the circuit several days a week, internationally and nationally. And when I retired at age 27, I held 29 international lap records, more than any other British driver, including Jackie Stewart, who was a world champion then. And I thought, I don't really want to get involved. The car, in fact, the Astra, had come to the end of its development life. We couldn't get any more out of it, and we weren't winning races, although I did win the last race that I was in. But basically, we needed a new car for the next year, which would be 1971. And I wasn't prepared to get involved in building a new car with all the expenses and the endless mechanical problems. And I wasn't an engineer or mechanic. I learned how to manage because I did it in the field and I learned through experience. But it wasn't my vocation. My vocation was driving. So I wanted to stop building cars and employing staff and metal workers and all sorts of other people and just race. But I found that sponsorship wasn't forthcoming. I mean, in those days, in the early part of those days, there was no sponsorship as such. You got free oil from Castrol, you got free spark plugs from Champion. I mean, when Jimmy Clark was world champion, his retainer from SA was £20,000 a year. I mean, you compare that to what Hamilton gets today, looking at 100 million. I mean, it's changed so much. Huge differences. Anyway, the point was, I didn't get any offers to drive. And I had trouble reconciling this, because I had the ability, and I'm not my own best salesman. I tend not to push myself. And I think I was so disappointed after what I'd done and achieved that I just stopped and walked away. As simple as that. It wasn't as if I wasn't scared, or I wasn't afraid. I wasn't losing my ability. On the contrary, I was still the youngest driver around, because most of the guys were in their 30s and 40s of those days. I just stopped. Maybe it was the right thing to do, maybe not. But that's what I did. But I can't tell you why other than that.
Thank you, Roger. Any other questions? Yes, there's one from over there.
Yeah, sorry, Roger.
That's all right, Nick.
So why did you step away from flying, and what's next?
Well, I haven't stepped away from flying. I'm still current, I still fly. But not like this, though. It's, Nick, by the way, is involved in hovercraft. And we're currently looking, or I'm looking at a project with my partners to buy a large 110-seat hovercraft built in the UK and ship it out to Sierra Leone to start a ferry service from the airport, which is on a peninsula, to the mainland. And there's 10 miles of water in between, currently serviced by small boats, which is unsatisfactory. They're slow. And in the rainy season, when the wind comes up, the sea state, the boats don't operate properly. So the hovercraft is the ideal machine to use there. Faster the boats, safer, and you don't need a jetty to land, you can just land it on the beach. And the idea is to ship this hovercraft out to Sierra Leone, initially, starting with one, and then order 2 more. Does the order go? It doesn't go. Does the order go through you, Nick, or does it go direct to Griffin? The order go direct to. Yeah. So and order 2 more new ones, which will follow on afterwards, and that's what I'm currently trying to do. So I mean, it's not flying as such, but it is flying in a way. So we haven't deserted flying, hovering.
Well, at least your pilot's licence becoming useful, because aren't they classed as aircraft?
Not anymore.
Aren't they?
They used to be on the Civil Aviation Register. Now they're on the MA,
Right.
MCA, sorry.
No, I don't think I want to fly backwards and forwards between Longing and Freetown anyway.
Hover, propeller, pilot drives it.
I wouldn't mind getting a rating on one just for the sake of it. See if I can do it. Yes, why not? I don't mind doing that.
It's the next story in the making.
I can always fill in for the crew if they get sick with malaria, which is prevalent out there. Everyone gets malaria. Yeah, good point, Nick. Thank you.
Any further questions for Roger?
Roger, what's the best moment of your life?
The best moment of my life? Well, there's so many. The best one.
I'll take 3 then.
3 or 33. I think motor racing was very satisfying. When you've had a good race and you've driven hard and you know you've done your best and you haven't had an easy win, and you come onto the rostrum and you're given this cup and it's full of this champagne and you've got the adoration of the crowd, that's a great feeling. And I've had that many times and it's wonderful. You know, it's a feeling of triumph and that you've done well and you're proud of yourself. So I think motor racing has given me a great deal of joy, and satisfaction, and confidence, because I had 100% confidence in my skill. And it's not, when you're racing, if you're not in the mood, and you're racing professionally, you're not in the mood, I mean, sometimes you wake up, you don't feel like doing a certain thing, it's very hard to go fast and push yourself to the limit. But if you don't push yourself to the limit, you won't win a race. So one has to control that emotion and put it aside, and regardless of how timid you may feel on that day, you've got to keep your foot down. And that's not an easy thing to do. But I found I could do that. So I think motor racing, yes, it was a great sport. It was a fantastic time with some fantastic people. And the costs were reasonable. The rewards were nothing. I mean, when you filled out the entry forms to the clubs, you had a choice. You could either win, if you won, you got a prize of £10 in club racing or a pewter mug. Well, I mean, I got more pewter mugs than I think any shop in England. But that's what it was then. And even if you raced internationally, I mean, when I won that race at the Montlhéry, I mean, that was an international race. Prize money was £500, which was quite a lot. But I mean, it's nothing like today. 500 race today, I mean, you're looking at huge money in comparison. And there were no major sponsors. I mean, these millions that you get now, they just weren't available. It's changed enormously. And I don't think it's necessarily for the good, because I asked Jack Brabham how much it would cost to buy your Formula One car and run it for a year in the World Championship Series. This included the races in South Africa and Australia. He said you can do the lot for £25,000. That wouldn't buy you a set of wheels today on one car. I mean, that's how much it's changed. I went to McLaren's and was talking to the manager there, and I said, what do you spend a year on motor racing? When I saw this place, I mean, Formula One teams in those days, they had moving vans with canvas awnings and a pair of runners, and the F1 cars would come down the back of these moving vans, and they go motor racing. And when you see the huge transporters today, I mean, they're out of this world. I mean, it's just so different. And I said, what do you spend a year? Well, he said, I won't tell you that, but he said, we have a department in Stuttgart which calculates how much we'd have to pay to the media to get the same publicity that we would need to spend on motor racing. And they were talking about several billions of pounds a year. Billions. And it was obscene. Another instance, he said we made a special paint up. You know, the German national racing colours are silver. And a Formula One body, I mean, there isn't much bodywork in a Formula One, so it doesn't need much paint. But he said we developed a paint which is lighter because in the silver colour you've got some amount of aluminium or some metals to give it the silver colour. We wanted to save that weight. So they spent £600,000 to design a paint to save probably a few ounces. I mean, it was unreal. I mean, how much paint's on a Formula One car to spend £600,000? But I mean, that's how it is today. And also, in period in the 60s, anyone could go into the paddock. You could talk to the drivers, you could talk to Jimmy Clark, you could talk to Graham Hill. There were no barriers, there was no security there. It's a bit like Goodwood is today, the revival meeting. That's why it's so popular. It was a much more human and friendly business. Although it was very dangerous because a lot of people got killed. I mean, Jimmy Clark got killed. We thought he was indestructible. I mean, he was like a god. We thought he was indestructible. I was at Brands Hatch on that day in May, and my girlfriend, Jill Everett, came running up saying, oh, have you heard? I said, oh, what, Jill? She said, Jimmy Clark was killed in Hockenheim today. I said, don't be silly. You know, we thought he was indestructible. He never came off. He never put a foot wrong. And yet here he was in an insignificant Formula 2 race, which he shouldn't have been in as world champion, and he came off and hit a tree at high speed. And that's what became of Jimmy Clark. So one never knew. I mean, you don't know what's around the corner. And then we thought, you know, this is why I think several people said when they realised that Jimmy could be killed, they realised that they were also vulnerable and they stopped racing. And Max Moses did the same thing when he heard that Jimmy had killed. He stopped competing and went into manufacturing cars. But these days, with carbon fibre and all this, and we had open face helmets. We didn't have proper rollover bars. They were just put there to comply with the regulations. But had you rolled the car, they would have just broken off. They were just 20-gauge steel tube. But and we didn't have seat belts. But nobody cared about it. But it's much safer now. Although the cars are faster, they didn't change gear. You haven't got a clutch. But you've got these carbon fibre, very strong structures, almost indestructible. You've got automatic fire extinguishing systems. All we have are these little aerosols, they're about the size of half a pint, which was again just to comply with regulations. They would be useless in a fire. And you've got runoff areas, you've got Armco barrier. None of those things we had. So it's changed dramatically. I mean, better in some sense because it's a lot fewer people are hurt. But it's lost some of its fun. I mean, Jimmy Clark, at that race at Montlhéry Park, which you saw, he entered 3 races there. There was the sports car race, the one I finished third to him in. He raced in Formula 2, and he raced his Lotus Cortina there, all on the same day, Saloon car. Well, that would never happen today with the world champion. So a lot of the fun has gone out of it. But if you don't think any better, if you're brought up in this era, and you see it on television and it's popular, they don't know how it was before. That's why I've gone to pains to explain to you, and it's called the Golden Era, and I think it was.
Right, one final question, any more? Before we round off? Yeah, one up the back.
What do you drive now?
I drive myself mad. Well, I'll tell you what I drive now. The week before last, I was in Italy, and I drove in a rally for the first time, and I hated it. I was driving a 500 horsepower twin-turbo 911S, one of 20 specials, one of 23 only made in right-hand drive. I was sitting in the passenger seat, racing around these Italian mountains. I was driving some at the time, and I'm clutching in the seat to try and keep myself upright in the seat, going around these corners. My foot sort of going through the floorboard, trying to brake and stop the thing, so I think we're going too fast. The driver's got the air conditioner on full blast, which is blowing right in my face, which gave me a terrible cold. That's why I've got a slightly gravelly throat at the moment. And frankly, it was a gut-wrenching experience. But the nightlife was fantastic. I go again for the parties afterwards, but I won't do a rally again. I drove on the new circuit at Mugello, lovely circuit. I mean, when you compare that to what we used to race, I mean, it's huge. You've got runoff areas, you've got a track which is like a billiard ball table, silky smooth. You've got wonderful pits, amazing food in the canteens, like a West End restaurant. And I took this Porsche round there, and we changed driving seats, and I took the owner around. It wasn't my car. And we lapped the entire field in this Porsche on the circuit. And when you put your foot down and the thing was at maximum VHP, maximum torque, it was like getting a kick in the back from a horse. The thing just shot forward. Very powerful. For my own car, I've got a Vauxhall. Nothing special. One more very short note. Back in the 60s, there was a young lady called Jenny Dill, who was my friend for a while, and she raced quite successfully. And we're driving around one night in my car, and she keeps looking at me. I'm saying, Jenny, I said, what are you looking at? She's saying, I can't understand it. I said, understand what? She said, I can't understand how you win races. You're positively owl-like on the road. And I am, she's right.
Right, well, I think it's getting on for 10 o'clock. I would like to thank Roger very much for giving us a very, very interesting insight to his life. And I'm quite sure, having talked to him over dinner, there'd be yards and yards and yards more of yarns and pictures that he could tell us. So maybe we'll have you back another time, Roger.
Well, firstly, thank you very much, John. I'd be delighted to come back. And thank you all for coming to attend. A pleasure talking to you.